I'm sure you all know the drill by this point. Spoilers for Silksong. If you ain't ready for those, come back later. Hello again. So, it's been a while, huh? Yeah, college has a way of keeping you busy like that. Well, now I'm finished with college, so it's the perfect time to make more Hollow Knight and Silksong theories. At the end of my last video, I mentioned I had more ideas regarding the Weavers of Deepnest that didn't fit cleanly into the script of the last theory, so I wanted to make another video discussing those. Well, this is that video. I now present to you an assortment of Deepnest theories, based off the new lore offered to us by Silksong. In this video, I want to cover the strange appearance of Hera the Beast compared to the rest of her Weaver kin, and I want to analyze the failed tramway, as well as the strange creatures that plagued its construction. Enjoy! In the cutscene shown after defeating First Sinner, we get to see how Grandmother Silk used her soul-infused silk to create the Weavers, expanding both their minds and bodies above those of normal Farlids. This, however, raises a question about Hera, one of the most prominent Weavers across the lore of both games, specifically her strange appearance. Between Hollow Knight and Silksong, we get to see plenty of Weavers, and they all share a very similar design, with a round mask for a head and a tall, thin body with many legs. Hera, by contrast, is seen having two prominent horns, as well as a much more rotund body and comparatively thinner limbs. So, what gives? Why does Hera look so different from the rest of her kin? Is she even related to them? From the Choral Commandment decreeing the capture of Hornet, we know that Hera is, in fact, a full-blooded Weaver, since it describes Hornet as the Weaver in half part. We also know from the cages in the cradle that the bugs of the choir were very specific about just how much Weaver blood their targets had in them, seeing as they went as far to specify if their targets were 1/4 or 1/8 Weaver, so half part should be taken literally, not as a turn of phrase. Of course, the Pale King certainly doesn't have any Weaver blood in him, so Hera must be 100% Weaver. In that case, why does she look so strange? My immediate thought on this matter was that Hera must have been from a species of bug in Farloom other than the Farlids. There's certainly precedent to suggest this is the case, as in Hollow Knight we see that the Pale King expanded the minds of bugs of all shapes and sizes. So who's to say that Grandmother Silk couldn't have done the same? It's possible that Hera could have been one of the earlier Weavers created, before Grandmother Silk decided that Farlids were the best candidates for creating her children. After doing some more research, it seems like I'm not the only one who came to this conclusion. And in fact, some people in the community were actually way ahead of me, identifying that Hera could have been a Draitmite before she was transformed into a Weaver. Honestly, I really like that theory, since the horns and the body of the Draitmite have a strong similarity to Hera's appearance, and even the cloth on top of the Draitmite's head seems to match what we see of Hera in the Red Memory. One of the main criticisms I've seen of this theory is that Hera must have also been a Farlid, since in their journal entry, Hornet notes that something of their assault reminds me of my own skill, and that this similarity between Hornet's fighting style and the Farlids must be due to a genetic connection between them. However, this argument ignores the very next line in that entry, stating, "Their talents are born purely of instinct. My technique is formed from hard training." Hornet draws a direct distinction between herself and the Farlids, stating that the similarity between her fighting style and theirs is simply coincidence, as her fighting style was something that didn't come to her naturally, and that she instead had to practice. Hera is still a Weaver, as she was a common bug that had her mind expanded and body altered by Grandmother Silk. She simply originated from a Draitmite, rather than from a Farlid like her sisters. The failed tramway was a construction project by Deepnest, which attempted to create a tramway running throughout northern Deepnest before being abandoned due to its construction being hampered by the naturally hostile environment. Based on the path of the tramway, it looks like had it been completed, it would have run from the northwestern end of Deepnest, only a short distance away from the distant village, all the way to the fungal wastes. The reason this failed piece of infrastructure fascinates me so much is because it demonstrates the political shrewdness of the Pale King, and his desire to bring all of the different kingdoms from Hollow Knight into Hallownest's sphere of influence, through internal integration. For those not familiar, internal integration is a concept in international relations that I've talked about in one of my previous videos. Roll the clip. Internal integration is a measure of how easily an entity can reach, access, and control everything that's a part of it. And for countries in particular, this means its land, institutions, infrastructure, businesses, and other aspects. Internal integration is important for countries because it determines how far a country can project its influence. If something isn't internally integrated into a country, then the country can't control it, and therefore, effectively, doesn't even own it. In this case, the Pale King wanted to build a tramway connecting one of Hallownest's territories to Deepnest's capital, thus allowing for the two kingdoms to be better connected, or if Deepnest refused to cooperate with Hallownest, to allow for the easy movement of Hallownest's military straight to Deepnest's capital without having to contend with the vicious landscape. Based on the placement of the tram door near the Maskmaker's room, as well as how the tunnel cuts off abruptly in eastern Deepnest, the starting point for the construction of the tram would have been on the western end of Deepnest, using the passage down from the Queen's Gardens as a staging ground for the project. Going through the friendly territory of the gardens to build the tram certainly seems more plausible than going through the cramped, bug-infested tunnels of eastern Deepnest, especially with the construction supplies and heavy machinery they would have been moving to the site. However, according to the Dreamnail dialogue of the bug at this bench, the tramway couldn't be finished, as Deepnest itself had simply rejected the construction project. This dialogue is of course referring to the interference from— Oh my god, what the hell is that thing?! The Dirt Carvers are without a doubt some of the best thought-out enemies in Hollow Knight, as they truly are perfectly suited to their environment. Their strategy of ambushing prey before quickly burrowing away into the ground is extremely effective in the tight tunnels of Deepnest, where their already disoriented prey will struggle to fight back or flee effectively. So with that being said, what on earth is going on with the Dirt Carver Hatcher? I mean seriously, these things make no sense. First of all, why do they have wings? The tunnels in Deepnest are a narrow, twisting maze, making it difficult to traverse even on foot, and winged creatures typically thrive in wide, open spaces, with lots of room to move around. Most of the winged enemies in the game reflect this fact. So how did a winged creature even come to exist in Deepnest in the first place? And furthermore, how are they birthing multiple fully grown dirt carvers out of them, which are immediately ready to hunt upon being born? It just doesn't make any sense. Hell, even the hunter's notes talk about how bizarre these things are, so what gives? Okay, so the way I see it, there are a couple of ways these things could have ended up here. First, maybe this is just a part of the dirt carver's life cycle. While it is true that winged creatures are best adapted for more open spaces, there is one part of Deepnest that actually meets that requirement. Wouldn't you know it? It's the location of the failed tramway, which happens to be the only place the Hatchers are found. So maybe this is how the life cycle of a dirt carver goes. They're born up top in the more open caverns, then burrow down into the more constricted tunnels to hunt for food. Once they reach maturity, they burrow back up to the open tunnels to undergo a metamorphosis into a hatcher, repeating the cycle. And I suppose it's not that weird that they're born already knowing how to hunt. After all, in the real world, there are various animals that are already born with some natural hunting instincts and reflexes, such as the stoat, which naturally develops the reflex to chase and pounce on moving targets, or the most venomous snake in the world, the inland taipan, which is born with the instinct to target small rodents for prey, as well as its striking instinct. However, these natural reflexes aren't nearly as comprehensive as those of dirt carvers, as the literal newborns seem to behave exactly the same as the ones that have been alive for far longer, without needing to learn anything through experience. However, the theory that the Hatchers are simply mature dirt carvers only makes sense if we assume that the tunnels at the top of Deepnest are naturally formed, and to be honest, I sincerely doubt that. The presence of a naturally formed cavern in the upper reaches of this otherwise cramped series of tunnels doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And while it is true that there are other large horizontal tunnels elsewhere in Hallownest, I think it's much more likely that the construction crew for the tram dug this tunnel themselves to make room for the tram line. If you look in the background of the failed tramway, you can actually see a series of arches built by the tram workers to brace the ceiling of the tunnel to prevent it from caving in. If this cave had been naturally formed, then this infrastructure wouldn't have been necessary, but these sorts of supports are regularly used for underground construction projects when digging tunnels. In the middle of the failed tramway, there's a section of the tunnel that was left partially undug, and this section was likely meant to be the tram platform, given the sign right here, which matches the signs present at all of the other tram stations, as well as some of the other infrastructure built up around this cluster of rock. Towards the end of the tunnel, you can see how the digging becomes more narrow before coming to a complete stop. This section of tunnel would have been more hastily dug before being abandoned due to the workers being rejected by the nest. However, if the tunnel wasn't dug naturally, then how did the hatchers get here? Like I said earlier, the climate of Deepnest absolutely wouldn't support a winged species of bug, so that eliminates the possibility that these creatures are naturally occurring. This leads me to the other option for explaining the hatchers. Their existence isn't natural. Rather, they began harassing the tram workers in a coordinated attack by Deepnest and the Weavers. In Silksong, it's shown that the Weavers have done experimenting both the areas of creating life, as seen with Ava, as well as selectively breeding bugs for specific purposes. The main example of the second form of experimentation is the flies in the slab, whose entire race was condemned to forever guard the prison as a form of punishment from the Weavers. We know that the Weavers were specifically responsible for using the flies as prison guards because the slab was built in the era when the Weavers still ruled Farloom. More on that in my previous video. Now, there are other examples of bugs in Farloom being spread for specific purposes, such as the squirms being raised to become the judges of the blasted steps, the muckroaches, which were bred for food, the bell beast being raised to provide public transit across Farloom, and the moorwing, which was used to keep the workers in Greymoor from abandoning their posts. However, these other options, aside from perhaps the bell beast, all seem to have been implemented in the era after the Weavers left Farloom, so it's more likely that the bugs of the choir took some inspiration from the Weavers' practices when breeding these bugs. Getting back to the Carver hatchers, it seems likely to me that they were actually some variation of the regular dirt carvers that were created by the Weavers, specifically to disrupt the construction of the failed tramway. Like I said in my last video, the Weavers fled Farloom because they wanted to escape the looming wrath of the pale being who created them. So they wouldn't have been happy to settle into their new home only to find it being encroached on by yet another pale being. Once the construction of the tramway began, the Weavers would have begun breeding the dirt carvers to create a winged variant, or may have simply used their knowledge of creating life to alter the dirt carver's form, and once they got a result they were happy with, they would have released them on the tram workers to drive them out of Deepnest. It's possible that the hatchers aren't even creating new dirt carvers, and instead the dirt carvers are being loaded into the hatchers. Or, since the Weavers are all gone, it's much more likely that perhaps the hatchers have been bred to go seek out dirt carvers, to carry to the surface to attack bugs in the tramway. This could explain why the dirt carvers that quote-unquote hatch out of the hatchers are already such adept hunters. They aren't actually newborns at all. Finally, I like this option because it explains why the tramway managed to have so much work done on it, with enormous construction undertakings having already been completed before being abandoned. When Hallownest first began making the tramway, the Weavers wouldn't have been prepared for an incursion of such a scale, and it would have taken them time to create a creature that was perfectly suited to combat the invading force. This is how Hallownest was able to complete so much of the tramway before needing to abandon the project. And the point when the digging clearly becomes more hasty shows the exact point at which the hatchers were released on the tram workers, and the project was abandoned. And that concludes all of the theories that I had about Deepnest, and the influence that the Weavers had on it after they arrived. In summary, Hera most likely looks different from the other Weavers due to being based on a Drapemite rather than on a Farlid like the rest of her sisters. As for the failed tramway, it was built in an attempt to better connect Hallownest to Deepnest, but was abandoned after being suddenly attacked by Dirt Carver hatchers, a variation of Dirt Carver created by the Weavers to keep Hallownest out of Deepnest. One thing that I find really interesting about these topics is that it seems like despite being set in a different kingdom, Team Cherry managed to add new lore in Silksong that actually manages to provide us with some answers to lingering mysteries from Hollow Knight. Deepnest is one of the best examples of this, being the main home of Hollow Knight's Weavers, who play a significant part in Silksong's story. If you've made it to the end, thanks for watching my video. I've been wanting to make a video about Deepnest and the failed tramway in particular for quite a while now, and I'm glad that I've now gotten to say my piece on it. I'm not entirely sure when I'll be getting my next video out, but now that I have more time after finishing college, I'm hoping it won't be 4 months, like the last gap between videos was. But in any case, I look forward to seeing you then. Remember to subscribe so you'll know when the next video is out. Take care!